My name is Kiley, and I'm going to talk about the command pattern in Ruby. All right. Happy Halloween if you celebrate it or live somewhere that celebrates it. This is my family last year at Halloween because went with the theme today. But my name is Annie. I work at DebtBook. We make financial software, and it's a big old Rails app with React too. So I'm doing this stuff every day. Full disclosure, I've been working there for 1 week and 2 days. So this is actually not most of my experience. For the last 7 years, I've been working at Viget, which is a digital agency. So I did lots and lots of different kinds of projects for lots and lots of different kinds of clients. Before that, I actually worked at 2 other agencies. So I've been a consultant for almost a decade. This is my first in-house product job. But the nice thing about consulting is you get to do a lot of different things and see what kind of patterns end up being useful in a lot of different places. And so that's why I'm talking about the command pattern today. It's one of my favorites, and it's come in useful for me in a lot of different scenarios. Also, I love Ruby. I've done work in a bunch of different languages, and I just feel like Ruby is the most fun as a developer. So I'm happy to be here talking to you all. All right, what is the command pattern? It's a technical pattern, and if you Google it, there's a lot of blog posts and there's a Wikipedia article and a whole bunch of information. And I am not going to talk about any of that today. We only have 15 minutes, so I'm just going to talk about it from a kind of practical perspective. The idea here is to introduce you to the concept. And if you want to kind of mess around with it, that's something that hopefully you'll want to do on your own after this. So for our purposes today, the command pattern is a little bit of magic that turns a method into a class. And we'll take a look at what that means in just a second. But not just any class, a class with a predictable structure. And that part's really important. If we all do object-oriented programming, and you can make a class or a method do basically anything you want, especially with Ruby, with all its metaprogramming, you can, there's infinite options here. But the idea here is to really provide a reliable structure that lets you do more with the things you're trying to do with your app. I realize that's all a little abstract. That's why I skipped all the details. We're just going to dive right into talking about it, and then hopefully have some time for questions. All right, here we go. This is just a little bit of Ruby code, and we don't need to go into it too far, but all we're doing is creating an object called a house. And a house has a certain amount of candy for Halloween. And then I'm just instantiating an instance of a house. So my neighbor's house has 500 pieces of candy. Similarly, we're just making a class called kid. Kids also have a certain amount of candy on Halloween. And we're going to talk about a kid called Adam. And he has 0 candies to start. So all you really need to know is that this house instance exists, neighbor house, they've got 500 candy. And Adam exists, and he has no candy. And down at the bottom, we're just kind of printing it so we can see what's going to happen. And when we run this code, it'll print this. My neighbor has 500 treats left, and Adam has 0 pieces of candy. Let's add a method. So all of this was just sort of set up. Let's add a method. So this is the same code we saw before, except down kind of in the middle, you've got a trick or treat method where a kid goes to a house and the house loses a piece of candy and the kid gains a piece of candy. And then I'm actually running, so I'm just defining the method first, and then I'm actually running it. And then again, I'm just printing out the results. So if I run this file now, because I ran the trick or treat method, the neighbor house lost a piece of candy and Adam gained a piece of candy. Great. So we're not going to worry about the setup stuff anymore. I'm just going to talk about the method from here on out. So that code is still there. It's still running, but it's not super important. So we're just going to focus on the method. And we're going to move it over here. So some pretty standard Ruby code right here, but let's adjust it. Again, remember, this is what we get when we run it. Let's try this. So instead of a method, trick or treat, let's make a class called trick or treat. We'll initialize it with a kid and a house, and then it has an execute method, which does the exact same thing that, that our method did before. And then if you look down at the bottom, I'm just running this code. So I instantiate, make an instance of this class. So trickortreat.new, pass in Adam, pass in the neighbor house, and then run execute. When I run this code, you will not be surprised. Again, the exact same thing happens. So you're probably thinking, great, we went from, 5 lines of code to 10 lines of code, and we're doing the exact same thing. Why would that be useful? And that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm actually going to make this even more complicated. I'm going to add a class method down at the bottom here that does the work of instantiating the new one. And the reason I like that is if you look all the way down at the bottom here, when I'm running the trick or treat method, trickortreat.run, and then I pass in Adam in the neighbor house. So this looks a lot like running the method over here on the left, but we're doing it with a class. And again, you're probably thinking, great, we have 5 more lines of code. Why would anybody do this? Which is a good question, and I'll show you in a little bit. So again, more code does the same thing. Why is this useful? Let's find out. This lets you actually do a few things. When things start getting more complicated, this becomes really powerful. It lets you manage the inputs in a much more robust way than you can do with a method on its own. It lets you run validations. A usual part of the command pattern is to kind of add in a validation step. So you can actually validate the inputs coming into your method. It lets you do the thing, which is the same thing your method was doing before. So that's the same. It lets you manage the output of your method in a very explicit way. And it lets you standardize errors. So that, I'm sure, all sounds great. And this has all been very abstract. So let's dive in a little bit to how this might actually be useful in your day-to-day life. My favorite place to use the command pattern is in Rails controllers. So let's look at some code that actually hopefully is a little more familiar. For this, I'm going to be using the ActiveInteraction gem. I highly suggest you check it out. The README of this gem has really, really good examples of how to use this and how to make it useful, way more than I can fit into a 15-minute talk. So if you are at all interested in this after I talk about it, I highly recommend that you just take a look at this gem, and just reading the README will do a better job explaining it than I can today. So using this gem, let's talk Rails. This is all going to be a little hand wavy because if I did all the details, it just was looked like a lot. So I'm just saying candy.all here, right? But if you were doing a traditional application, you do, @candy equals candy.all and use that in your, or candies equal candy.all and use that in your view. Or maybe if you're running an API, you'd render JSON or something. I'm kind of just skipping that, but just for readability purposes. But other than that, consider this a pretty typical controller where part of what's happening in the index action is that we need to fetch all the candy. So let's see how the command pattern can help us make sense of our controllers. All right. So over here on the right, we have the same candy controller, except instead of straight calling candy.all, I'm calling another class called candy index. That's going to be our command. And I'm saying run, which is do the thing. And then I've just moved the candy.all into that class. So that class is right below. So again, you're probably thinking, great, we went from one class and one method to 2 classes and 2 methods. And why would we do this? Let's take a look. Before we show you that, let me say, pretty often you start with something like this and then somebody says, oh shoot, we need to be able to filter our candies, right? Maybe by the date they were created, right? If candy's too old, we don't want to get it. So now I'm going to change both of these things to manage that change. So over here on the left, I've updated the non-command pattern controller to take in a param start date and a param's end date, and we'll filter based on that. Over here on the right, I've done the exact same thing, but with the command pattern. So I'm now passing in params to my command, candy index. And then here's where it starts to get interesting. So down at the bottom on the right, candy index, notice what I have up here. It says date time, start date, date time, end date. I'm managing my inputs really, really clearly here. And what ActiveInteraction will do for you here is actually a bunch of things. So first, it's only going to accept those inputs. If you try to pass anything else in here, it just ignores them. You can also make it strict and make it throw an error if you want to do that too. But so you're already, once you're kind of running this class, you're only going to deal with the inputs that you've explicitly said are okay. And that's really nice. So if you use this pattern, you actually don't need to use strong params because it's going to do all that same stuff for you. And then actually a little bit more. You can still use strong params if you want to do that. You just don't have to. It's also going to cast whatever comes in here, so start date and end date as inputs. It's going to cast them to date times. So if somebody tries to pass in a start date that's not a valid date time, or a string that can't be cast to a valid date time, this is going to throw an error, which means it's not going to try to do anything else because the inputs can't be what they're supposed to be. So I've actually already gained a lot here. If some nonsense params are coming in, this command is going to throw an error and it's not going to try to do anything else, which is really, really valuable. This is how you can kind of catch any problems with your inputs very first thing, instead of getting like an error way down the line where it's like, you know, string nonsense can't be cast to a date time or whatever. And it's not just going to throw any error. It's going to throw an error that says start date is not a valid date time. That's a human readable error that you can return back to your users in your controller. So while this looks really similar, the fact that you can specify what the inputs are really gives you a lot of control over what's going to kind of move down through your code. All right, so you've added this, you get start date and end date. And then next up, some weird stuff starts happening when people try to pass in params where end date is actually before the start date. So you end up wanting to validate. It'd be really nice if you could just control the fact that end date has to be after start date. Well, the command pattern and specifically ActiveInteraction will let you do that too. So keep in mind that that's the new feature that we want. And then I'm just going to move some code around. All right. I'm not going to talk about the non-command pattern controller anymore. We don't really need the comparison, but I am going to separate these two classes. So over on the left, we have our controller that's running the command. And over on the right, we have the actual command class. So the same thing we were just looking at, I just moved it. So it's no longer a comparison. This is all code that would be an application right now. We also need to handle errors. So this is actually one of the really cool parts about this pattern. And I kept saying that the candy index, this command, is going to throw errors if the inputs aren't valid. That's pretty great, but you got to do something with those errors. ActiveInteraction's errors look a lot like active model errors, and you can do all the same things with them. So you'll say outcome.valid. This is going to look really similar to how active model does things. So that means if everything went great in the command, you can do whatever you want, right? Like outcome.result is going to be whatever is returned in the command, in this case, all the candies. And outcome.errors is going to be an errors object that looks a lot like what you're used to with active model. That's really powerful. This kind of if-else statement over here in the controller, that's going to be the same in all of your controller actions if you're using this pattern. And so you can abstract it out, and your errors are always going to look exactly the same, which means it's really easy to kind of manage what your errors look like when they get back to your user. I didn't go into all the details of how you would do something with these error objects because of time. And like I said, just kind of the complexity. It's a little much for this size of a talk, but this is what your controller actions end up looking like, though the bottom part can just be abstracted out right away. So let's go back to that feature we wanted to add where we really don't want people passing in end dates that are after start dates. You can validate your commands exactly the same way you're used to validating your models. So over on the right, I've added a validate. End date must be after start date. And then I've added a little private method that does exactly that. So I can, if the end date isn't after the start date, I'll explicitly add an error. I can add it to the end date input. You can also add errors to the base, which are just general errors. And then it'll say must be after start date. So what this does is we've now added kind of another step to our life cycle. First, we're going to process our inputs. Then we're even going to validate our inputs. And you can get more and more complicated validations. The nice thing about this is if at any step something goes wrong, ActiveInteraction stops what it's doing and returns errors. It's not going to go try to get all the candies if the inputs aren't valid. And then your controller, even though you've added this validation step, doesn't have to change at all. You're already handling errors. And all of these errors are going to come back in a human readable way if you're smart about it. And you can just, throw those, straight into your error message. There's a lot of power in this, especially as things get more complicated, right? Maybe you want to be able to filter by type of candy, right? You only want to get chocolate, but you want to restrict the filters. You could even so you can validate that the filter params that are coming in are exactly the way you want them to be. Over time, this pattern, so your controllers hardly ever change. They all just kind of look like this. You just pass things straight through to the commands. But over time, I found this really, really, really helps clean up a Rails application. It gives you a clear place to put all the logic that's happening in a controller. And it lets you really cleanly manage errors and make sure that you're always returning nice human readable errors back to the user. So if nothing else, I highly recommend you check out ActiveInteraction. It's just a fun, so it's a really good gem. I've used it a lot. It's well maintained. And it can help you do these things, right? So manage your inputs, run validations, do the thing you want to do, manage your output, and standardize your error handling. So it's more code than just a method. But if you think about sometimes how complicated your controller methods can get, this kind of abstraction, this service layer has been the best one that I've tried. I've also used it in a bunch of other places, but I think the controller example is probably the best one. And that's all I've got. Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I might have. Yeah, and again, I highly recommend checking out the ActiveInteraction gem as just an exploration. I think putting together this talk made me realize that 15 minutes is not really long enough for this talk, but the idea was show you what we got and then we can go from there. Yeah, thank you for your time, and thank you to WNB. We were talking in the breakout room. This is a great community, and really appreciate everything all you're doing.